presentation by Deidre Johnston. And Deidre is, she goes by the nickname Dee Dee, which I'm going to use from now on. And she's recently retired. Deidre Johnson, PhD, was Associate Dean of Global Education and Professor of Communications at Hope College. She earned her PhD from the University of Iowa, a master's from the University of Texas, and her BA from Drake University. And she is going to talk about what is happiness and how do we realize it, both in our culture and maybe another culture or two. So without saying anything more, go ahead, Deidre.
Excellent. Good morning, HAPS participants. It's wonderful to see you this morning. I'm delighted to be here to be able to join with you. I'm going to share my screen with you. And let me just make sure we've got everything going here so I can see what I'm doing. I think we're all set. So today we're going to talk about happiness. And when you're happy, do you know it? Culture and the experience of happiness. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about some of the research on what makes us happy, predictors of happiness. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about different countries in terms of how they rank in terms of happiness and life satisfaction research. And then third, I'm going to talk about some research that Dr. Rika Hanamitsu from Waseda University in Japan and I conducted, and what we found about differences between happiness and the experience of happiness in Japan and in the United States. So that's where we are. So you'll see the picture as we get started that, my conclusion, I'll just give you at the beginning. Perhaps all we need to be happy is a dry diaper, a full tummy, a helping hand, sunshine and leaves, and a mummy to run towards. So sometimes it's the simpler things that make us happier than life, and we complicate this to no end. But let's delve in a little bit deeper. So what are the predictors of happiness? There's a tremendous amount of research on happiness, and there's a whole area of called positive psychology that has grabbed onto this. And so in the last 10 years, the research in this area has just grown exponentially. What I'm showing you with this chart is what predicts your happiness. And there is some evidence that genetic set points, there are some genetic factors that account for up to perhaps 50% of whether or not you're happy or not. Maybe only account for 10, and maybe there's some things we can do in our own lives to really shape our own happiness that we have absolute control over, these intentional activities that might yield up to 40% happiness. Hold on just a second where I move some things where I can see it. So this particular pie chart has been a little bit challenged over the last 10 years since the research was published. The authors themselves even say, well, maybe we simplified this a little bit too much. And the challenges have not been so much about what these three main predictors of happiness are. That's pretty much agreed upon by most researchers, but a little bit of challenge over is the genetic really 35% rather than 50%. Our life circumstances really more 15% rather than 10%. So that's the endless arguments in the academic journals. But in general, I think that it gives us a framework to begin with. So let's look at each one of these things in a little bit more detail. So if we look at life circumstances, these are things like demographic variables, age, sex, wealth, relationships, religiosity. Dr. David Myers from Hope College has done a tremendous amount of research in this area, is very, very well known. And this is the area that he does a lot of his research in. And I'm going to go over this very superficially, and I encourage you perhaps for a future session to have him back to talk about this in more depth. But age is pretty stable in terms of happiness over a lifetime. There are modest variations as family structures change, young kids at home versus teenagers. We all know what happens when you hit the teenager age, when the kids leave an empty nest, but pretty stable over the lifespan. Probably some of that variation is due to income security and health over the lifespan, that those things impact us at different age points in our lives. Biological sex, male, female, very little variance has been shown in the research for differences in happiness. Wealth, the idea that money can't buy you happiness, well, it's not entirely true. Money can buy you happiness up to a point, but it's not that more money brings more happiness. So you need enough money to not be stressed over financial decisions, not be stressed whether or not you can afford to go to the doctor when you need to, not be stressed as to whether or not you can pay your child's school fees. So some of the most recent research suggests that, around $100,000, that yields happiness for people. But then you reach diminishing returns over $100,000 and certainly over about $200,000 to $250,000 a year, and happiness doesn't increase anymore with more money. So moderately wealthy lifestyle that you can meet your basic needs and then some and not feel that financial stress is related to happiness. Marriage or stable supportive relationships are related to happiness. And we see fairly consistent data on that. Religiosity is kind of a question, and this is where this model gets a little messy. Is religiosity an intentional activity, or is it a life circumstance? Sometimes it's a life circumstance because it depends on where we're born, what family we're born into, what religious faith education we get as a child and that we grow up in determines our religiosity as an adult. But there is some evidence at the individual level that religiosity, and particularly church attendance in the United States, has a positive correlation with happiness. When you look at states in the United States, it gets a little bit messier because states that score high on religiosity are actually lower on happiness. So if you look at Mississippi as one example, higher on religiosity, but lower on happiness because of other factors of education, health access, and other things, income disparity that are affecting happiness in those particular areas, and some policies and state government that affects happiness. So again, these things get a little complicated, but life circumstances, a chunk of what makes us happy. The genetics research has really taken off, of course, in the last 10 years, and really kind of interesting stuff. So there are 2 genes thus far, and they're going to be, I'm sure, many more that are associated with happiness. One is associated with serotonin and dopamine levels in the brain. Another gene that seems to be related to happiness is connected to antisocial behavior, addiction, and aggressiveness, things that make people unhappy. There's research on neurotransmitters, hormone levels, physical health, attractiveness are all some of the genetic factors that contribute to our happiness, and ones that I think we sometimes overlook, that a big chunk of whether or not people are happy and what predicts their happiness does come down to some genetic basis. The third area, these intentional activities, again, tremendous amount of research in recent years on this: mindfulness, practicing meditation, general optimism, not putting a negative spin on things, memory, meaning that you process the trauma, the negative experiences that you have. Perhaps you talk about those, you think about them, you don't go into denial, you work through them. So you go through the flames and the fire of the difficulties of life. But interestingly, you're supposed to analyze the trauma, but not analyze the happiness and joy so much. So the happiness and joy, if you look back on your past experiences and you just wash yourself in the experience of, that happy memory, but don't try to analyze it too much. Evidently, when people try to analyze their happy memories too much, they end up being less happy, perhaps because they start questioning just how happy they were. It's sort of an interesting paradox there. So mindfulness, meditation, general optimism, memory factors, gratitude is a big one, and you've probably seen some of the popular press research on that keeping a gratitude journal, remembering at the end of the day 3 things that you're grateful for, that you're thankful for, really does make a difference in happiness. Practicing loving kindness toward others, compassion, forgiveness, kind of related to this focus on other people rather than continually being focused on ourselves, If we are always looking inward and always analyzing ourselves and focusing on ourselves, we can get ourselves into some bad places that we are not happy. But that focusing on other people, what can I do for others, is something that seems to sustain happiness and has a tremendous impact there. And then having a sort of life purpose. It seems that people that find meaning in life and find a direction in life and think that they have some purpose that they're serving, that also contributes to their happiness. So again, we see these three different areas: life circumstances, genetics, and intentional activities that can impact our happiness. Then what happens when we add culture into the mix? Culture is messy. If we compare cultures on how happy they are, the question is, are we really measuring the same thing? Does happiness mean the same thing to different people within different cultures? So Vinhoven in the Netherlands started this research decades ago, where he did rankings of the happiest countries in the world, and this has since been taken over by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and based on Gallup polls. And so this comes out every year, and you've probably seen this when it hits the news, where there's a rank ordering of the happiest countries in the world. And as you can see from this, the Scandinavian countries always do very, very well, consistently well. They're at the top of this list in terms of reporting being most happy. And people question, why is that? People speculate that when you have free healthcare, free education, low crime rates, extended parental and annual leave, and a culture that really focuses and reinforces work-life balance, that this promotes these highly satisfied ratings of their happiness within these countries. As you can see, the United States is down about 14 out of about 157 countries, I think, that they are using at this point for this particular research. And then when we look at the unhappiest countries in the world, perhaps no surprise there, in that if you don't have basic food, water, shelter, security from war, safety, access to education, access to healthcare, occupational opportunities. These are often countries that have a very high rate of youth unemployment, that happiness is lower. So in order to experience consistent happiness in our lives, we need the basic needs met. And then the other things in our lives are just toppings on top of the sundae of happiness, shall we say. So let's look a little bit at how happiness is measured in these cultural studies. So these are typical questions that are asked on like the world ranking studies. And my question to you is, can you answer these questions? On a 5-point scale, does your 4 on the scale, is that quantitatively different than my 2 or 3 on that same scale? Are we interpreting it in the same way? One researcher challenges that North Americans are not happier than East Asians, but are simply more willing to proclaim their happiness on a survey. So somebody's a little skeptical of these results. Other researchers found, for example, that Asians prefer to use the middle response on a 5-point or a 7-point scale, and Americans prefer to use the extremes for either a 1 or a 5, not anything in the middle, right? So that in and of itself is going to bias your responses. But all that said, let's allow that these questions do get at something related to happiness. I think there's some meaning to the country rankings. However, I think there's some nuances there about how people experience happiness that may be missed on these measurements. They're generalized across large groups of very diverse people who may find themselves within the same national boundaries. And we know that within the United States, we have a lot of different cultures represented. You go to some place like South Africa with 11 official languages, you have even more cultures. And so we're generalizing and putting all those people together because they come within a particular national boundary. and treating them as if they're all the same. So those are some of the ways that we lose those nuances of maybe what's going on in terms of people's understanding of happiness. So the question is, are we trying to compare apples and oranges here when we compare countries and how they interpret those surveys? Or more pertinent to the things we're going to talk about today, are we trying to compare sushi and sashimi, where there is really a difference? So the question I want to explore in more depth is, does the meaning of happiness differ by culture? Okay, does the meaning of happiness differ by culture? The first problem we run into is, how do we define culture? And I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but trust me when I say that in academia, across the humanities and social sciences, culture is a very problematic word these days, because people are recognizing that what we have talked about when we talk about culture in the past, and a lot of research that was done on countries and nations. So the culture of the French, the culture of the Germans, and what again that failed to recognize were all the diversity within French culture, or all the diversity within the boundaries of Germany or the boundaries of South Africa. So that we can't really reduce a culture to just national boundaries any longer. That is not accurate, and it's not an accurate representation of people. So culture becomes problematic. How do we define culture if we can't just use nations any longer? Another question to start to ask ourselves, is happiness as a life goal a Western ideal? This begins with Aristotle's discussion of languages. And Eastern cultures, the goal may not be that my goal in life is to live a really happy life. It may be that my goal in life is to prepare for the future long after I'm gone. And so this idea of a long-term orientation, the fostering of virtues oriented toward future rewards, in particular perseverance and thrift. And life is a short moment in a long history that happened before me and happens after me. So this idea of happiness as a life goal, that I just want my kids to be happy, my goal in life is just to be happy, that may be a little culturally biased toward the West in terms of thinking that way. Then the next question is, do people reflect upon or think about their happiness in the same ways? In Western culture, think about how we talk about this. We count, we quantify our blessings, our pains, our position relative to our former selves, or our expectations or significant others. We recount our past and our future through the stories that we tell, both in our internal monologues with ourselves and also with those that we share with friends and family. So this focus on numeric quantity and the value of interpretation, again, may have some cultural bias here. In contrast, there's evidence that based in Buddhism and Confucianism, many Eastern cultures have a tradition of the quality of a moment of experience is far more important than the quantity. And there's a tendency in Buddhism and Confucianism to avoid these introspective navel-gazing analysis of me. So that can change the way that we think about happiness. So if you think about, people in conversation might say, I've been to Hawaii 7 times. Does 7 times going to Hawaii create any more happiness than 1 time going to Hawaii, experiencing Hawaii? Think of the way that we kind of fall back on and think about these things in terms of quantity rather than quality. So another question, does happy mean the same thing? If I ask if you're happy, and I'm asking people from different cultures, does that really mean the same thing to them? What aspects of life are thought to matter as a basis for happiness? Is it money? Is it family? Is it status? Is it how many children you have? Are some more important than others? What's the meaning of life? Is it short-term gratification or long-term delayed gratification for an afterlife or for a family legacy and a succession? So happy could mean different things or be based in different things for different people. Then is happiness experienced? So we've talked a little bit about thinking, about how we think about happiness, what we mean when we say we're happy, but how is it experienced in our bodies and our feelings? Is it a linear progression so that I work to become more happy every day, and I'm only happy if I'm more happy than I was yesterday? And in the West, we tend to think about it that way. You know, I'll do this, I'll work really hard, I'll spend all this time at work so that I can be happy in 10 years. Or I'll spend this amount of time in school and this is really a grind, but I'll be happy in 15 years. So we see it as kind of a progression, and that a successful life is that we should be happy and happier yet as we progress through life and we get better and wiser at living. Is happiness, other cultures might view it more as cyclical. That happiness is up and down, or happiness is a holistic thing that you can only evaluate if you look at not at what you're experiencing right now, but if you look at your whole life. That's the only way that you could evaluate happiness. Other ways that experience of happiness might change. Is happiness excitement, surprise, or is it calmness and serenity? That seems to be a different experience that we experience physiologically, mentally, emotionally. That's a very different experience, but yet we put all of that under the label perhaps of how we experience happiness, and again, might vary by culture. When we talk about how we experience happiness, also there's something called hedonic adaptation, that we have a sort of set point for happiness, and then something joyful happens and we feel, wow, we are so happy and we're so excited. And then that dissipates and we go back to our set point. And we're at our set point and something traumatic and devastating happens and we are very, very sad. And then over time, we come back to that set point. So hedonic expectation is this idea that we kind of have a set point individually, perhaps culturally, that we come back to, that's consistent over time. Let me look at the next one. So we've talked about how you think about happiness, what happiness might mean, how you experience it in your body. What about the ways that happiness is expressed? So some people like to talk about their feelings, and will tell you exactly what they're thinking, exactly what they're feeling in great detail. And other people are very stoic and they keep their feelings under their sleeve. We also see this in how happiness is expressed. And we'll talk more about this in terms of cultural variations and how different cultures express happiness. Are our perceptions of happiness influenced by culture and sociocultural conditions and expectations? These things can involve things like time preference. It's the emphasis on how happy you are in the present, the recent past, the distant past, or an anticipated future happiness. And again, people may view that differently. How does religion as a sociocultural factor affect people's happiness? If you believe in an afterlife, does that change how happy you are? Or worry about postmortem rewards and punishments, does that change how happy you are? If you're thinking in terms of your culture has an emphasis on legacy, how, if at all, is the assessment influenced by thoughts of our postmortem influence on the people and places that survive us? If your culture has more emphasis on self-concept, is a discrete individual the main or only consideration, or do some people evaluate their own life satisfaction only as a part of a wider collective, that it's not just about me being happy, but everybody needs to be happy for me to be happy? So these are some of the things that we're going to explore. Another one is how perceptions of happiness are influenced by social comparison. And we know from a great body of research this to be true. We know that social media exacerbates this. So we recount narratives and interpretations internally to ourselves and to others in the stories that we tell. And we tend to be happier if our life circumstances are similar to others, and unhappy if there's disparity and I am found to be lacking in terms of social comparison. So that also makes cultural comparisons problematic and challenging, because people may be comparing themselves when they evaluate their happiness to different groups. And the last one, are there some kind of cultural set points for happiness? In other words, are there some cultures that are more happy or optimistic than others? And rather than the country ranking that looks at just how satisfied are you, those first rankings we looked at, I think, have a lot to do with current economic conditions in the country, current employment conditions in the country, current security in the country. So I think this is an interesting contrast. It's research that looks at optimism. So dispositional, individuals' optimism. How optimistic are individuals in that country? And then if we take those people together, what is the average for a country in terms of how optimistic they are? And you get a much different set of countries on this list, don't you? I mean, this is fascinating. Estonia, the most optimistic country, according to this research, and they researched about 60 countries for this. And I've given you, I think, the top 12. I thought it was also interesting, given Ukraine and their current situation now is at the top end of countries under normal situations as being very optimistic. Mexico, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Peru, Colombia on the top of this list for optimism. And then look at pessimism. So these are the bottom 12. So the United States was 12th from the bottom of the list in terms of optimism, meaning that they are more pessimistic than most countries. We have the United States, France, which I think is funny because French people always talk about how pessimistic they are as a country. They like to gripe and complain a lot. Japan, very pessimistic at the bottom, which we'll bring into our discussion a little bit later as we go deeper into Japan. So this is the idea that as a culture, is there a kind of level of pessimism or optimism that people within a culture learn and reinforce through their social behaviors? Okay. So that brings us to, does the experience and meaning of happiness differ in the United States and Japan? So I want to talk a little bit about a specific research study that I conducted with Dr. Rika Hanamitsu from Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. And we're not approaching 11 o'clock on her side of the globe. I thought she might be able to join us today, but it's a little more difficult when you're 13 hours apart. I met Rika a number of years ago in Japan, and she came to the United States twice to Hope College as a visiting professor, most recently in 2018, 2019. So we began on an adventure of doing a study on happiness, and the data collection for our project was rather unique. We recruited a stratified sample across 4 different age groups. And stratified means that we made sure that we had the same number of participants in each of 4 age groups. So we had the 18 to 29 group, the 30 to mid 40s group, the mid 40s to mid 60s group, and the over 65 group. And we had people representing each of those 4 age groups in the United States and each of those 4 age groups in Japan. And we had about 80 participants in each country. And each participant in the study was given a disposable camera and a booklet with questions. And participants were instructed to conduct the project during a 24-hour period when they noticed that they were experiencing happiness. They were to pause, take a picture, a photograph that represented happiness at that moment, and answer the 5 narrative questions or prompts about what they were experiencing in that moment. Participants also took a short standardized pre and post test about how happy they were at the beginning of the 24 hours and then at the end of the 24 hours. What we got out of this was a tremendous amount of quantitative data. So all of the photographs were coded, all of the narratives were coded, and then we ran statistical analyses on that data. And then we also had qualitative data of just analyzing the narratives as a whole and analyzing the photos. So what were our research questions? Basically 4 things that I've kind of highlighted already. Do people think or reflect upon happiness in the same way across these 2 different countries? Does happiness mean the same thing? Are people thinking about different things when we ask them if they're happy? Do people feel the same thing, the same sensations physiologically and emotionally in their bodies when they talk about being happy? Or are there some differences there? And do people express their happiness in the same way across these 2 different cultures? So those are our 4 big questions. What we found, let's talk first about thinking about happiness. We found differences between the United States and Japan in terms of how concrete or abstract the responses were, how experiential, meaning I'm doing something, I'm active, I'm describing to you the experience that I'm feeling, versus analytical analysis of their happiness. Timelessness, their reflections are beyond time. They're not time specific to the specific recall of a specific event, a specific story that they want to talk about. So let me give you some examples of this. American participants were more literal and concrete in their experience of happiness. So seeing my bike makes me happy. So this is a photograph that we might get, but different types of response. Japanese participants were more symbolic and abstract. My bike is a symbol of good health. That's different. So American sees a bike and reports that their bike makes them happy, quite literal. And a Japanese participant sees their bike and reports that it's a symbol of good health, much more abstract. An American participant says, riding my bike makes me happy, experiential, the experience of what I do with my bike. But we saw much more symbolic responses in the Japanese sample. A Japanese participant says something like, a bike reminds me of a parent's love for their child when they buy the child a bike. Wow, that's much more abstract, symbolic.
Take your pills.
Hello? We doing okay? Okay. Bill, give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if there's something wrong, you can't hear me.
I just had to mute someone. You're good, Dee Dee. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. I just heard something in the background and didn't want to be talking into the cyberspace and nobody was on the other end hearing anything I said. Second thing that we explored is the meaning of happiness. Happiness is, and what we found is with the Japanese sample, happiness is more ritual, tradition, specific events, and food. Food played really big in this. And what we found in the photographs then and the reflections of the United States participants, where happiness is relational, it's who I'm connected to. So the things and events that generate happiness varied by culture significantly, statistically. Japanese participants recorded food and ritual events significantly more often than did American participants. And American participants reported animals and specific people or the number of people involved in an event as a source of happiness significantly more often than the Japanese did. So the meaning of happiness, happiness is defined primarily relationally in the United States, where the meaning of happiness, I'm happy, happiness is an enactment of a ritual or a tradition, was much more likely to be reflected in the Japanese responses. And this is not to say that family members are any less valued in Japanese culture. I don't think that's true at all. It means that what makes me happy as a Japanese person is more likely to be associated with tradition, adapting to social norms, fulfilling my relational obligations. Fulfilling social rituals makes me feel connected as a Japanese person. So what I'm seeing here is happiness means social connection, but it takes different forms in these 2 countries. Even food in Japanese culture connects me with the social fabric of my culture because I know that everybody is eating almost identically the same thing that I am for lunch today. And in fact, we even got that specific response. Everyone I know is eating noodles for lunch today. That connects me to my society, to my culture, to my community. In contrast, having people and animals that I love connects me as an American. Doesn't really matter to my happiness whether anybody else loves my kid or my dog, but it's more family, immediate family, my dog, but that connects me to what is important at a smaller scale where the Japanese are seeing happiness and being connected to a larger social fabric. So the meaning of happiness, still focused on the meaning. Another difference that we saw is a focus on other versus a focus on self. And so in the Japanese pictures and photographs and reflections, there would be discussion about, see how happy the people are in the wedding party in that top photo. And I just sort of laugh at this because of its lack of expression on the bride and the groom, which we will get to in a moment is more typical of Japanese culture. See how happy they are. The next one down is a photo of, let's see this. It was interesting to watch people from other countries dressed up in yukata. So it's an inference about what other people are feeling, that they're feeling connected. That brings me happiness. The wedding party is happy. That brings me happiness. In contrast, in the United States respondents, it's, I got an A on a test. I've got a plane ticket and I'm going to go on a trip. I love to listen to music on my headphones. See the difference between I get my happiness from other people being happy versus I get my happiness from what I myself am doing and what I myself am feeling. Another thing we found on the meaning of happiness regards valence or positive or negative. In the United States response, almost without exception, all of the feelings associated, the events associated with happiness that people recorded in their photos and in their narratives were positive, 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 positive. I'm happy, I'm delighted, I'm enthused, I'm surprised, I'm energized, all positive things. In the Japanese sample, happiness was tied to both positive and negative emotions. So we got a lot of responses that were nostalgic, with a note of sadness of something that is past, but that thing brought me happiness, or melancholy associated with happiness, or loss, grief, regret, even being associated and integrated into happiness. And this is almost unfathomable from an American cultural perspective. How can grief and loss be associated with happiness? And other researchers have found that while Americans rate positive and negative feelings as opposites, Japanese participants will rate them as correlated, as connected to each other. You only know joy and happiness by knowing sadness and despair. In many ways, this is a richer and certainly more complex way of thinking about happiness. Seeing my father's urn makes me happy because I can hear his voice in my mind. This was an example of a response from the Japanese sample. So that integration of positive and negative emotions associated with happiness. And also still on that meaning of happiness, is the meaning different, what happiness means. We see a difference in a sort of cyclical view of happiness and a linear view of happiness in the United States. The Japanese respondents focused much more on the past and the future, and the US respondents focused much more on the present. And previous research has also found that Japanese people are more likely to take ups and downs in life as a whole into account when they assess their happiness. They're also more likely to rate their present happiness on whether or not they think things will improve in the future. So a Japanese participant writes descriptions of happiness that both past and present were all connected with the future, was one of the narrative responses that we got. Past and present were all connected with the future. Americans presume I should be happier today than I was yesterday. I should be making progress toward ultimate happiness in my life. In comparative culture studies, we talked about countries with long-term orientations and countries with short-term orientations. And this long-term orientation comes through in the Japanese photos and responses that we got, that happiness is on a, goes up and down. It's viewed more holistically as past and future as well as present, where Americans think of happiness as more episodic, in the moment type of experience. This one I found fascinating. So how do you experience happiness? We've talked about the meaning of happiness. How do you experience it? And there is, again, tremendous difference between the Japanese and the American responses. Japanese experience happiness as a positive state, something that continues over time, and Americans experience happiness as a transitory moment. And again, you see this kind of connected with the previous point that I just made. So Japanese participants were more likely to report happiness from quotidian experiences. For example, my noodles make me happy as I have these same noodles for lunch every day. Another one, walking to school makes me happy as I walk to school every day. Walking makes me happy because I have legs. When was the last time you thought about that, right? American participants, so it's in the everyday. It's in the everyday experiences for the Japanese experiences. Even though those experiences may be the same every single day, still focusing on that makes me happy. And that consistency perhaps even plays into part of that happiness. In contrast, American participants were more likely to report happiness from unexpected events and surprise occurrences. This might suggest that American people might be too dependent upon the unusual occurrence rather than fully appreciating their daily routines as a source of happiness. And this could actually be a factor that limits the experience of happiness for Americans. If we're only waiting for the big event, the big surprise, the unexpected, that's what makes us happy, rather than finding our happiness in the sameness every day and being grateful for those things. So in experiencing happiness, we see a difference again that's supported in a lot of other research as well. I feel happy when I am calm. For Japanese participants, I feel happy when I am excited. For American participants. So American participants were more likely to experience happiness associated with higher arousal. And Japanese participants were more likely to experience happiness as low arousal, calmness, contentment. It's consistent with other research and again might suggest that American participants do not fully appreciate calmness and contentment, or at least do not associate with happiness to the same degree that Japanese participants do. So when we look at the words that people use in the narrative reports to describe what they were feeling, in the US respondents, we see excited, joyful, surprised, proud, peaceful does make the list, but it's not the main theme here. Energized, exhilarated, versus the Japanese responses: relaxed, peaceful, refreshed, satisfied, relieved, accomplished, thankful. Calmness, serenity, contentment is a much different physiological, mental, and emotional experience than is excitement, surprise, and joy. Those are experienced differently in our bodies, but yet we're calling it the same thing cross-culturally. It is important to note that older adults in both cultures were more likely to experience happiness associated with things that were expected, not a surprise, lower arousal, like calmness, contentment, and quotidian events and associations with past memories. So we see more similarity in older adults across both cultures. So let's look at expressing happiness, our fourth area of findings. Americans' descriptions of happiness reflected more words. They were more loquacious, more feeling words associated with happiness. Japanese participants' descriptions reflected more single word feelings. And in the Japanese language, one word, depending upon context, might have a lot of different meanings. So it took some time and finesse to kind of tease out what was going on here with such different ways of responding to our prompts. But this is important because American people seek more specific and nuanced feeling words in their expression of happiness, and Japanese people were more likely to describe happiness through non-feeling metaphors and associations. And what we see is that the expression of happiness, both verbally, how you describe being happy, and non-verbally, your body demeanor, differs between the American and Japanese culture. And I have a very small clip I'm going to play for you. I apologize, this is not closed captioned. It's only a minute, and it was before closed captioning was available to do this. So I apologize for that. The next clip I show will have closed captions on it.
For the first time, I went to the Disneyland, and then I had a ride, and then I heard a big screaming voice, very deep, harsh voice. And then I turned back around. I saw two big men screaming. I was so surprised because in Japan, men and adults shouldn't express their emotions in public. So that's really surprised me.
I came to the United States 19 years ago, and I was staying at a friend's house for the first couple of days, suffering jet lag. And I had the opportunity to watch the TV programs in which that's a game show. And in the game show, the contestant, he won just a big prize. And all of a sudden, he started to jump up and down, screaming. And those are the kinds of behaviors you don't see in Japan at all on TV or anywhere. And I felt really envious of the fact that the people are free to be able to express their feelings. And that was the first time I felt that I was in a different country.
For the first time,
Okay, so you see from that clip that different in both the expression verbally and nonverbals. I thought were so poignant in that particular clip of the differences between the expression of happiness and excitement in Japanese and American culture. One final finding, just to keep in mind, is the mindfulness of happiness, that pre-happiness, we gave everybody a quantitative test of happiness. How happy are you at the beginning of their 24 hours and also at the end of their 24 hours? A couple interesting findings there. Pre-happiness was significantly higher among Japanese participants than it was among the US participants. And that's a little unusual because many of the cross-cultural studies of happiness between Japan and the United States usually report the United States reports greater happiness than Japan. But what I thought was also interesting and reinforcing yet again, what we should already know is that the process of engaging in the study itself had a significant impact on happiness. So when you ask people to take pictures during the day of times when they're happy and what makes them happy, and to reflect upon that in a little journal and write about that experience, about why that makes them happy, that very process of doing that, being aware, paying attention to the things in your daily life that make you happy, that very act of doing that increased their happiness. So they were happier at the end of the study than they were when they began the study. So all of the stuff that you hear about taking time to reflect on your gratitude is reinforced again by these findings. And I think it's a good reminder for Americans from what we know from this comparison of between Japanese and American participants in this study, that we as Americans need to focus more on the everyday kinds of things that make us happy. We don't have to wait for the big event, the big surprise, the unexpected, but to relish and absorb the happiness that we get from eating the same thing for breakfast every morning, or having that cup of coffee, or having that cup of tea, and reminding ourselves of how happy that really makes us. So why is this important? Overall, this study is important because comparisons of countries on the ranking of happiness do not reflect that different cultures may experience, define, and contextualize happiness differently. In terms of intercultural communication, when we refer to happiness, we may not be referencing exactly the same experience. We can learn from each other the ways in which each culture may constrain or limit the experience of happiness, and this knowledge could promote greater happiness for all of us. In addition, the study of cross-cultural happiness promotes intercultural competence, because it's more likely by understanding this type of thing that we are able to understand others' emotions and experiences, as well as having greater self-awareness about our own emotions and experiences. So we know from this research that thinking, interpreting, experiencing, and expressing happiness does differ across cultures between the United States and Japan, and probably across other cultures as well. We learn some ways in which cultures may constrain or promote the experience of happiness. And I think, again, that promotes cross-cultural understanding. Let me check time here. We have time. Bhutan is really interesting because the king of Bhutan 10, 12 years ago decided that Bhutan, and it really put Bhutan on the map. It's a brilliant strategy, because otherwise I don't think most of the world would know where Bhutan was. But the king of Bhutan decided that, we really can't compete in the global marketplace for gross domestic product, because we're this tiny little isolated area up in the mountains. So let's redefine what our goal is. Maybe it's not making more money in the global economy. Maybe it's being happier and living a happy life. And what would it look like if we put our government, our legislature, our judicial system, everybody at work to build and cultivate happiness, so that we are the happiest place in the world? So I've got a brief little video clip for you to describe a little bit about what's going on and some of the challenges Bhutan has as trying to establish themselves as the happiest place in the world.
It's a daunting climb to one of the holiest sites in Bhutan. Tiger's Nest Monastery seems to defy gravity. Every Bhutanese is expected to complete the pilgrimage to ensure peace and happiness. When it became a democracy in 2008, Bhutan put happiness at the center of all political policy, inspiring the UN to pass a resolution urging other nations to follow Bhutan's example. But how do you measure it? Many Bhutanese, happiness is more intuitive than it is quantifiable, but ever since it became part of state policy, it's been described roughly as good governance, the balance between nature and economic growth, also between pleasure and work. In the capital, Thimphu is the world's only Secretariat of Happiness, and a chief official who takes his job very seriously.
The GNH index is formed based on the 9 domains and close to 33 indicators, things like health, education, living standard, environment, good governance. One is psychological well-being. The other one is community vitality, time use, and cultural diversity.
This is one way people find happiness in Bhutan, through traditional pursuits, such as the national sport, archery. But the nation's happiness policy sometimes misses the mark. Youth unemployment is soaring. 24-year-old Namgay Tenzin is restless for new opportunities. He can't find suitable work.
There's a major problem in Bhutan right now as the unemployment, because most of the youngsters, like after their completion of graduation, they couldn't find a good job.
Neighboring India has been generous with financial support, but some think it's time to welcome Chinese investment too. Bhutan has no diplomatic links with its northern neighbor. But balancing ties between fierce regional rivals will be a challenge. It's a risky path. The happiness of the nation could depend upon it.
For me, happiness is just just what I need is a peace and a good leadership in our country.
For me, happiness actually means spending quality times with friends and families and visiting beautiful places and taking pictures.
So there may not be a magical, mystical, or even spiritual formula when it comes to finding happiness, but by simply turning its pursuit into policy, Bhutan has done what no other country has. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera, in the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan. Come on.
Okay. In conclusion, Eric Weiner wrote a book called The Geography of Bliss, which I highly recommend. It's a very fun read, but he goes around based on those international country rankings of happiness, visiting the countries and talking to people about what makes them happy, and it's very entertaining. But his conclusion, I thought, was just so very well stated. Money matters, but less than we think, and not in the way that we think. Family is important. So are friends. Envy is toxic. So is excessive thinking. Beaches are optional. Trust is not. Neither is gratitude. So happiness, Kant once said, is an ideal, not of reason, but of imagination. In other words, we create our happiness. And the first step to creating anything is to imagine it. So I hope that provides you with some happy hope today. We can take some time for questions or discussion, and perhaps if you have cultural experiences to share of happiness in different cultural contexts and the way people in different cultures experience and express their happiness, that might be a very fruitful avenue for sharing and discussion for us this morning.
Great, thank you, Didi. I do have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is that South and Central American countries did not seem to be on either list in the beginning of your presentation. And the question is whether or not they were included in the research.
They were included in the research, and they do score on some of the country optimism scales. The optimism scale I showed you looked at dispositional optimism, meaning as a personality trait among individuals. When you ask people, are you hopeful for the future? Excuse me, my screen is going bonkers here and something just popped up. I'm not sure why.
Stop it so we can all see each other there. Okay.
Okay, there we go. On some of the things that look at, the near future, are you optimistic about next year? Do you think things are going to improve for you in the next 5 years? Actually, the South American and Central American countries scored much higher in that area, which I found very encouraging, given some of the challenges that they've had, particularly, and that was recent research. So research that's been done since the pandemic and COVID that has devastated some of those areas.
Great, thank you. The only other question is from Bill Wells, and it is there research about epigenetics and happiness?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Is there research about epigenetics and happiness?
I have no idea, Bill. Perhaps you could fill us in on that. That is very much out of my area.
Okay.
Do you
That's all I have in the
respond to
chat.
that,
So
Bill?
I guess I should explain myself a little bit. Epigenetics is the study of how we interpret things both physically with our bodies and emotionally with our bodies, having to do not with our core genetic code, but how that code is expressed or restricted from being expressed. Yeah. And it's almost chemical, where they're your DNA may have other compounds attached to it that don't allow certain genes to be expressed, some of them being genes involved in our emotions.
Right. I would guess that this is a burgeoning area of research. There's certainly some research on the physiological experience of emotion, where they look at PET scans of the body in terms of what areas are activated when people are experiencing different types of emotions. I don't think that research has really gotten to any cross-cultural sort of comparisons yet. But yes, that's fascinating. And I don't know that in any depth of that area of research. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Great. If anyone else would like to unmute themselves. Oh, I see Ben Hancock. Go ahead, Ben.
Dr. Johnson or Dee Dee, I find your presentation fascinating, and you're my new favorite person. And the reason I say that is we're each of us in our own time frame, and again looking at the demographics of HASP, we're all kind of retiring or have retired, and we think of what we want to do in our second life. Okay, and so you're kind of rediscovering what makes you happy, or redefining what makes you happy. And you used the phrase earlier in your presentation about you start going down a rabbit hole. Well, that's not all bad, in that the more you research this, there's a whole body of work out there. And you start to see how it overlaps, no matter what the culture is. And so you start reading things like Ella Luna's book, The Crossroads of Should and Must. Or you'll pick up a book about blue zones and areas of the world like Yokohama being one of the blue zones, and longevity having to do with happiness, but happiness in a different way, more of a Japanese context of happiness and what that involves. And then you start running across books like Ikigai and Ichigo Ichi.
Yeah.
And Wabi Sabi. Okay.
Yes.
And if you read works like Paul Coelho's The Alchemist, and pursuing your own personal legend, okay? So what comes out of this for me, and that's why my new best friend or hero, is that you start to design your own personal, deliberate, integrated practice, okay? And that's everything from once you identify some of those things that might be of interest, and then you stay with them long enough. There's a phrase in one of the books called Kaika, which is noticing something inside of you that wants to blossom and having that evolve into Mankai, which is the practice and the deliberate practice toward focusing on that. If you read Malcolm Gladwell's work on 10,000 hours, that's all about, you don't become a genius overnight. You're not born with it. It's through practice. So you develop those areas of practice that make you happy, and you start to see the synchronicity and the epiphanies that you run across. All of a sudden, I mean, I was reading about Ikigai in a bookstore in Amsterdam, and I was climbing up the steps of the bookstore, and there was the book Ikigai. I wasn't looking for it. I just read about it, and there was this book. So it's fascinating. There's a whole body of work out there that is relatable for each of us if we take the time and really want to pursue that. It's not everybody's thing. It's kind of my thing in terms of understanding what makes you happy and what are those things so different than maybe your career. My career was in higher ed and I loved it, but I want to do something completely different in my second life. So this pursuit, if you will, is fascinating. And it takes you cross-culturally, getting back to the essence of your presentation, because you can find different ways, different cultures, how they pursued it, how they've defined it, and resonate with some of those themes, even if you don't adopt them, across the board. So thank you, and it's been very delightful.
Thank you for your comments. There are so many things that it's like I want to talk more with you about the different things. Several things that you mentioned. The research on Okinawa is very, very interesting in terms of longevity and also how people are living very fulfilling, happy lives. And so you can, if you Google that, you'll find a lot written about that. You'll find some videos and things that are interesting on that. And as far as Wabi Sabi goes, when I decided to try ceramics and the potter's wheel, I embraced the concept of wabi sabi because it's beauty in imperfection. So my cups didn't go up like this, they went like that. And they had wobbles in them, but I decided I needed to embrace that. But these concepts and learning cross-culturally are so enriching and give us so many different and new ways to view things. So I admire your reading list and the rabbit holes that you've pursued.
Well, I've often thought if we look at the nonfiction work that HASP does, each of these books, which are nonfiction, would fit very well, even one of them, in terms of some themes that are worth discussing that are relevant to so many of us.
Yes.
That's a great idea. All right, I've had a couple more things come into the chat. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, pass that along to nonfiction books, by the way. Love that idea.
Yeah.
Let's see, Dr. Johnston, what are your assumptions, if not conclusions, about the spread of social media throughout the world and its influence on happiness? Oh boy.
Yeah, there's a lot of research coming out, and I think it's pretty solid, that suggests that social media does not make us happier. And a large part of that is the way that we get sucked into social comparisons with other people. Like, well, that person's posting happy pictures. You know, my life seems rather mundane. Why don't I have a happy picture to post that's as happy as their picture? So particularly for teenagers, we see quite a lot of research that talks about the dangers of this social comparison that comes from social media. It's also interesting in terms of social media, gaming, all that this new technology has afforded us in terms of distractions. And when we know so much research focuses on mindfulness, awareness, that we need to notice the deer in the backyard, notice the bird in the tree, notice the leaf on the, and my granddaughter is great for pointing these things out, right? You know, she can find a leaf on the sidewalk and take 5 minutes to analyze that leaf. That's a level of awareness and mindfulness that when we're playing video games, when we're sucked into the amount of time that social media demands from us, we're not doing those things. We're not aware of our noodles and appreciating our hot udon for lunch because we're distracted. And so I think that also is an area that is very concerning for our happiness and well-being.
I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who said, obviously so long ago, and I always tell my girls, my daughters, this quote is that comparison is the thief of joy. And that is, in my opinion, the downfall of social media is comparison. Yes. For sure. Okay, next question is, can you speak to the contagiousness of happiness? How, if you show your happiness, can you elevate the moods of others? Are more socially expressive cultures more happy?
Oh, interesting. Wow, what an interesting question. So the contagion factor, there's certainly some research evidence of that it not only makes other people happier, but it also makes you happier. So if you're feeling sad and you just mindfully think about raising the corners of your mouth, even a little bit, physiologically, your body tells you you're happier, you're more content. So that we know that it works also for other people who we're interacting with and also for ourselves and can make ourselves happier. I think that's fascinating about whether more expressive cultures are happier. And I don't know, I would have to go back and look at some of that data when I think about the international rankings on, where Scandinavia scores really high on how satisfied are you with your life right now, which again, I think plays into a lot of socioeconomic and security variables. I don't think of those cultures as particularly effusive emotionally with high affect. moderate, I guess. And then the optimism group, where we see Estonia and some of these other, Nigeria, Uganda. I think it would be interesting to look at those and see whether those are more expressive cultures. And when I think about Nigeria and Uganda as an example, my perception, not based on research at all, but my perception is that those are more affect display cultures in terms of happiness and joy and expressing those. But that's a very interesting question.
Okay, two more. One is just whether or not you can tell us where to find, or maybe send us a link to the citations for the research studies that you mentioned, specifically the study comparing US and Japan.
So my own research on US and Japan, there's actually, I can send you some others as well. So
okay.
Part of the challenge in doing research is Rika, my colleague, went back to Japan. Family circumstances hit her like a tsunami. And so the problem is getting it out and getting it published. And I have a list of things in my newfound retirement that I want to work on. So I don't have this published for you, but there are, I can give you a link, and I don't know what the best way to do that would be. Kim.
Probably if you just send it to me at hasp@hope.edu in an email, then I can send it out to the class register.
I've got somebody else in mind that does US and Japanese research that's excellent, that addresses this. So yes.
Great. And then the last question I have right now is, what differences in happiness have been studied with regard to ethnicity and race?
Mm. Not much.
Okay.
That's also just a really interesting question. I can't think of any.
Like, how about in the US? Do you know if there's any in the US? No.
I don't know of any research in that area.
There you go. There's your next project.
There you go. Look it up. Yeah, that's an interesting question. But within the US, dividing samples by ethnicity, race in terms of happiness results, no, I'm not aware of any research in the area that's really delved into that.
Okay.
So, wow, you guys have great questions for future research. You need to all start on these projects.
I know. That's typical HASP for you. They have good questions. Yep. Great. That's all I have in the chat. If anyone else wants to ask a question or make a comment, go ahead and unmute yourself. We have a couple minutes left.
I'd sure like to thank Dee Dee for her presentation. I've been chasing her for several semesters.
You have.
And she finally ran out of excuses when she retired. And she said yes this time. So
you persevered.
I did. Well, thank you very much. It's a marvelous presentation.
Yeah.
Thank
A lot
you.
of good information there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Always a joy to talk to you, and I will send that information to HASP. And again, really great questions. I encourage you to all pursue.
I don't have any question, kind of, but my experiences in life have left me wondering about happiness. I mean, happiness seems like it should be a spark of joy or something like that. I was married, had children, but my married life was kind of, well, it wasn't giving me all the happiness I thought it should. Husband had been relieved of his job, and I, I encouraged him to pursue his love in art, became an artist, and things, but there was a tension always, and it wasn't, so happiness was kind of a tentative thing. Well, it broke down to that he asked me, he was told me he was going to divorce me. And so I thought, well, maybe there's my happiness, because it's not me that's the it took the weight out of myself, blaming myself a lot. And then, but then there's the question of what's going to happen to my children and things like that. And then another experience I had was that I was kind of being happy at my work because I had something to do that was fulfilling to me. And then I got called in and told that the people I worked with didn't care for the way I did things or something like that. And I thought I was on a happy time, but I didn't. And I couldn't, I was a nurse, and going to another department by this time was kind of I was older, I was 63 years old. What am I going to do? Like, how do I adjust myself to this? And thought, well, maybe it's time to pick up retirement. But in the meantime, I had a house that I had mortgage on forever. And I reached out to family and said, does anybody have any ideas? What should I do? Because I can't go to another nursing station. I just didn't have that in me. And so my happiness about what my situation there into within, a 10-year span had really changed. And I got relieved because my children didn't say, come on, live with us, or something like that, which I understood. They had families of their own and they lived far away. And how do they take care of a mom? And so sister came up with coming to Holland, back to Holland, which was my roots in the first place in my life. And I have a true happiness since coming here and expressing myself with so much. And I found great happiness in being with HASP for this, because it's invigorated my life.
Thanks, Suzanne. That is so nice.
It's kind of a long, drawn out thing, but it's the changes you meet in your life that make you adjust.
Yes.
And you can find happiness. Thank you, HASP, for being here.
Thank you. That is so kind of you to say that. I hope that's what we do. I hope we bring happiness and meaning to people in retirement. That's certainly our goal. That's great. Thank you so much. This was awesome. I hope everyone has a happy, joyful day. Notice the little things. Great to see you all. Dr. Johnston, hope to have you again sometime soon. We appreciate your insight and research and work so much. And thank you, Bill, for bringing this class to us. Thank you for your persistence.
Yep.
I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much.
I'll see you at noon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.